welcome everybody. So this is the first event of the year for the CIWEM Southern branch. So we're hearing today from Darren, the ex-chair. I am now the new chair for this forthcoming year. So this is part 3 of the Coast and the Climate, Changing Climate sort of seminar series that we were doing last October, November time. This one unfortunately has to be cancelled, so we're just rerunning that today. So just a little bit. So yeah, forthcoming year we've got sort of a new committee. I'm the chair, and obviously with this new online platform, we are trying to arrange at least one event a month and keep those varied and keep those sort of regular. So keep an eye out, particularly on LinkedIn and things. We'll be sharing those. Just for today, a little bit of housekeeping. So this will be recorded and will be shared on the website and possibly the CIWEM YouTube as well. So just a reminder to stay muted and camera off. If you have any technology issues, that's what the chat box is for, and we'll try and deal with those, see if lots of people are having the same issue. Q&A we're going to deal with at the end, so if you have any questions, it'd be great if you could pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll go through all of those at the end and allow Darren to answer those. There are a variety of upcoming events that Barbara's posted in the chat. They're quite lengthy. There's 4 major upcoming ones, so if you wish to have a look at those, maybe take a look at the chat box. But there's one on the 24th of February, climate change adaptation. I forget the second part of the title, sorry, but that's using a new platform with sort of new networking features and things. So maybe take a look at that if you're interested, and it's free to attend. So plenty of exciting things going on. So I won't waffle anymore. I'll pass over to Darren, and yes, we will do questions and answers at the end. And just to note that the talk is the whole thing should only be about an hour. Talk being about 40 minutes. Just so you've got some reference there. So great. I'll pass over to Darren.
Thanks, Anya. So hello to you wherever you may be in the world and whatever time it may be. So my name's Darren Lombroso. I'm a technical director at HR Wallingford, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about some work we did at looking at how the resilience of low-income communities in the United States could be increased to coastal flooding by learning lessons from some low-income countries. And on this first slide, you can see some guys on a moped. They're in Bangladesh, and they're going around warning people about a tropical cyclone that's about to hit the country. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But I'm going to start in the United States in a small place called Brunswick, which is in Georgia. So on this map, it's denoted by a black spot. So it's in the south of Georgia. And it's a pretty small place. It has a population of about 77,000 people. There's some typical sort of pictures from Brunswick. It's right on the coast. It's got fairly old buildings. It has got a port, it has a reasonable amount of roll-on, roll-off ferry trade. And the thing about Brunswick is that, and indeed a lot of Georgia and the Gulf of the United States, is that it's very vulnerable to coastal flooding. So here's a Google Earth image of Brunswick. You can see that it's on an estuary, and to the right of the slide, you've got the Atlantic Ocean. And Georgia hasn't been hit by a storm surge for a long time. The last big storm surge in Georgia happened in 1898. And it was so big that it actually made the front page of the New York Times. So there we see some reporting in the New York Times. There are a lot of fatalities and some photos of the aftermath. Doesn't really show the devastation that happened. But the storm surge of 1898 was about a 5-meter wave. It was a pretty big wave. It caused lots of damage. And there's reports of between sort of 100 and 200 people dying as a result of that storm surge. But there hasn't been one since then, so over 120 years. And since then, 2 things have happened. The population of Brunswick, and indeed many coastal states in the United States, has increased considerably. And the awareness of coastal flooding has gone down. So there've been a number of surveys done by the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US and also county emergency management agencies. And they find that the awareness of coastal flooding is low. Many people aren't aware that their houses could flood, even though they're at serious risk if a coastal surge did occur. So we did a small modeling study of Brunswick. So this is a slide showing a hydrodynamic model that we set up of Brunswick to recreate the 1898 storm surge, using that as a boundary. And you can see Brunswick is pretty much underwater in this event. And what we then did was we've got an agent-based model that looks at evacuation times and loss of life from flooding. We applied that. So we used data from the census, road network data to look at evacuation. And we had a building database, and they were all put into this model. And we wanted to see what would happen in terms of fatalities if the 1898 storm surge happened today. So just to talk you through the slides, so this is a typical slide of what you get for the output from the model. So on the left, we've got the hydrograph of the storm surge, and you can see where you are in hours with the red line. And then on the right, we've got the outputs from the model, and the blue is the flood wave, and the dots represent, the black dots are buildings, but the other colors are people. And the key colors to look for are that when the dots turn red, it means that there's been a fatality as a result of flooding. So if they're yellow, the people are leaving, and if they're green, they're safe. So we did, I'm not going to run an animation, but we basically ran two events. We looked at the current day storm surge, or the 1898 storm surge, and then we looked at what it would be with a 1 meter climate change. And we looked at various scenarios of how many people evacuated, ranging from 5% of people not evacuating right through to everyone not evacuating, to look at the number of fatalities that could occur. So here's some screenshots from the model. So you see the storm surge is about to hit. People are purple, which means they're unaware. This is where the storm surge begins to hit. And you can see the dots turning green. So this is with just 5% of the people remaining. So this is assuming that 95% of the population has evacuated. But even with that, you can see it's a pretty devastating effect. You can see the number of red dots, the number of people that would potentially die in this event. So that's going through that event, the flood wave moving away. So this is a table of the results, and they're quite shocking. So what we have is, on the left-hand side, we've got the percentage of people who don't evacuate, ranging from 100% down to 5%. And on the very right, we've got the fatality rate. And if you look at the fatality rate, it's fairly consistent. It's about 45% of people who don't evacuate would die. So even if 5% of people don't evacuate, you've still got over 1,100 fatalities. Now, this is a model, so there's a large amount of uncertainty. And we were quite shocked by these results, but we were working with the County Emergency Management Agency, and they said, well, yeah, this seems actually like a pretty reasonable number. That's why we tell people it's so important to evacuate if there's a major storm surge. And then we did a similar thing. And in this modeling, what we did, we assumed that 5% of the population wouldn't evacuate, but then the model was set up such that they would have access to a safe haven. So a safe haven would be maybe a public building that would be resistant to the storm surge, and also, more importantly, a building where they could evacuate vertically in that building and get above the flood wave. And we put those safe havens dotted around Brunswick to see whether that would have a significant impact. So this is the modeling, and you can see people turning yellow. That means they're moving, they're beginning to evacuate. And the thing to note is, as I click through these still frames, is compared to the previous modeling, there's very little red. So there's very few fatalities. So I'll just go back. You can see on that screen, very few fatalities compared to the one where people weren't able to evacuate vertically into buildings. So there was also, in this case, some flood warning, so the people knew that the flood was coming. But you can see that there's a significant difference in the fatality rate. So it drops from about 45% to about 0.4, 0.3%. Again, a lot of uncertainty in these modeling results. But the but is you're showing a significant change in the number of fatalities. So it shows that maybe there's something in this type of strategy to increase resilience to coastal flooding. So that's Brunswick. That's a very micro view. But if you want to look at a more macro view of social vulnerability in the United States, there's been some work done by the University of South Carolina. And this shows a map of the social vulnerability to environmental hazards, I think, on a county basis. So this is all environmental hazards, whether it's tornadoes, coastal flooding, et cetera, and it's classified into three groups: high, which is red; medium, which is white; and blue, which is low social vulnerability to environmental hazards. And if we go zoom into the Gulf area, you can see that almost all of Florida is red. And indeed, a lot of the Gulf states and the Carolinas and Georgia, they're either red or white. So they've got a medium or high vulnerability. And in fact, what's happened in the US in the past 60 or 50 years, the disparity in wealth between rich and poor has increased fairly significantly. Poorest people tend to find themselves living on the fringes of urban areas or in rural areas, and they're increasingly, not just physically, but also socially isolated. So they have limited social networks. There was a quite a famous book, I can't recall who it's by, called Bowling Alone, and it's about this sort of loss of social networks where people are actually going to bowling alleys by themselves because they don't have anyone to go with. And there's other things that have really made people more vulnerable to coastal flooding. So in the coastal zone, I think I've only got figures between, I think it's 1970 and the year 2000. The number of people who were living in mobile homes in the coastal zone increased from 8% to something like 22 or 23%. And obviously mobile homes are far more vulnerable to coastal flooding than a brick building. Also in the Gulf region of the US, it's something like 90% of the most socially vulnerable people live in areas that are highly likely or highly subject to coastal flooding. And it's only 8% of the less socially vulnerable people who live in those areas that are vulnerable to coastal flooding. So there's this issue of how can the US increase the resilience of these disadvantaged communities who live on the coast to flooding. And the US Army Corps of Engineers wanted some, I suppose, advice that they could potentially feed into policy. And that was the reason behind doing this work. So that brings us on to resilience. And what do we mean by resilience? And this work was carried out with some colleagues at the University of Southampton, and there's many, of course, definitions of resilience, but the one that we used was this one, where we break down resilience into three components. So this is a graph showing time on the x-axis, y showing increasing resilience, and it's kind of conceptual graph of resilience showing that the first component we called absorption. So that's if you have a shock, whether it's a flood or a hurricane or whatever it may be, when you've got absorptive resilience, you're resisting the initial impact of the shock, and it relies on strategies to cope with the shock rather than sort of implementing proactive changes. So basically, at best, if you've got absorptive capacity, at best you're returning to the resilience level you were before the flood or before the shock occurred. You may be below it. Then there's another component, which is adaptation to shock. So that's where you either have a reactive or hopefully an anticipatory response, and that allows people to function during and after the shock without having significant impacts on their lives. So you're actually increasing resilience. And then the third part we looked at in terms of resilience was transformation. And that's maybe a bit like what's happened with COVID-19. So that's where something fundamentally alters how society functions. So it can happen incrementally or it can happen suddenly. And in terms of resilience, you're looking for a transformation in resilience to make people much more resilient to, in this case, coastal flooding. So what lessons can be learned for low-income countries? And we looked at specifically 2 countries. The first one was Bangladesh in South Asia. So here we have a map of Bangladesh. It's mostly floodplain. It's very densely populated. It's not that well off. You know, if you look at the per capita gross domestic product, it's the 141st in the world. It also ranks fairly low on the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. And 50% of the population live in the coastal floodplain. It is probably one of the most vulnerable countries to tropical cyclones and coastal flooding in the world. So this graph here shows the human cost of cyclones and coastal flooding in Bangladesh by decades. So what we have on the y-axis, we have the number of fatalities, and on the x-axis, we have the decades. And the red lines show the number of fatalities from tropical cyclones and coastal floods. And that dotted black line shows the increase in population. So you can see in the 1960s and 1970s, there was some significant cyclones and coastal flooding that had an incredible death toll. The Bola in 1970, the tropical cyclone then, the official death toll is 500,000 people died, and that's the official death toll. And there's many people who think that actually it's much higher than that. Then in 1991, there was another very significant cyclone and coastal flooding. It killed between 140 and 150,000 people. And then if you look after that, although the population is still increasing and the number of people at risk is increasing, there haven't been as many fatalities. There was a serious event in 2007, Cyclone Sid, which resulted in something like 3,500 deaths. But it had the same strength as the cyclone that happened in 1991. There was probably almost maybe 35, 40% more people at risk, but the number of fatalities was significantly less than it was in 1991. So that, I suppose, begs the question, what's happened in Bangladesh to increase the resilience of coastal communities to coastal flooding and cyclones? Well, a number of things have happened. That over the years, from the 1960s to the present day, there's been a number of measures that have been implemented. And this table shows you across the top the decades. The red is the cyclones, and then it's got details of the various measures that have been implemented. So I'm not going to talk to this particular slide. There's a lot of information on it. A link will be provided to somewhere where you can see this if you're interested at looking at this in more detail. But what I'm going to focus on is some of the main measures that were implemented and the reasons they were potentially successful in reducing or increasing resilience to coastal flooding. So the first one is cyclone shelters. So early in the 1960s, Bangladesh started constructing cyclone shelters. So concrete structures like these, which were resistant to coastal surges, which were above the coastal surge, which you could shelter in. But at the end of the 1960s, there were only about 100 of these, nowhere near enough. And even in the 70s, there was only about, when that big cyclone hit in 1970, there was only 200 shelters. I think they each had a capacity of about 1,500. So you can do the maths. There wasn't enough capacity in these to really make any difference. So after 1991, after the 1991 cyclone, that acted as a catalyst to set up a task force on cyclone shelters. And following that event, 2,000 multi-purpose shelters were designed. And one of the things that was learned from the initial cyclone shelters is that for people to use them, they have to be something that they use on a day-to-day basis. So you can see in this picture, this is a primary school. So many of these shelters were built as primary schools so that people's children were going to them, they knew where they were, and they felt comfortable in them. Because one of the issues with the earlier shelters were that they were often used by men, and when they weren't being used as cyclone shelters, which is most of the time, they were used as mosques. And they felt, for many women, they felt like they were the domain of men, so they weren't used by women. There still are a lot of challenges to overcome with cyclone shelters. Bangladesh still needs a lot more. It probably needs another 4,000 or 5,000 cyclone shelters. But during the event in 2007, where the death toll was significantly less than the 1991 cyclone, it's estimated that about 1.5 million people sheltered in these. So they're really important, but there's still a lot of work to do. There's still work to do on protecting people's livestock, which is very important to them, which often there aren't sheltering places for them. The other thing that's happened in Bangladesh is improved preparedness. So this picture here shows some guys who are members of the Cyclone Preparedness Protection Program. And this is a voluntary organization that was set up in the late 60s, early 70s by the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. And it's a voluntary organization with a large number of volunteers. So for example, in 2000, there were 32,000 volunteers, and the latest figures that I've seen for 2015, there were 50,000 volunteers. So they don't get any monetary benefit for doing this. They're purely motivated by altruism and by the fact that many people have been affected by coastal flooding and cyclones. And they get training. So they're trained in first aid, they're trained in warning dissemination, they're trained in rescuing people, helping vulnerable people to evacuate, pointing people in the directions of cyclone shelters. And it's reckoned that they can alert about 8 million people across the coastal region in Bangladesh, and probably assist another 4 million with evacuation. So they're very important, and it's really helped with preparedness, and along with these type of things, there's also a number of community-based disaster programs, primarily focusing on women. So they assist in organizing what's called micro groups, which are about 30 or 40 people who are volunteers, who volunteer to help the most vulnerable during flood events. The other thing that's happened is improved forecasting. So over the years, Bangladesh has invested in various radar modeling, and the predictions of cyclones now are fairly accurate. They're pretty good, 24 hours in advance of them hitting landfall. So that's really helped, and that's of course improved the forecasting, has helped to feed through to the warning. And finally, the other thing is education. There's been, this is from a colleague that we work with, a chap called Professor Aina Nishat, who's done a lot of work producing material like this, which shows people the dangers of floods and also shows people how they can mitigate. And they've been produced in Bangla. They're widely disseminated in schools and to communities to help to provide some education about what they can do in floods. So that's Bangladesh. So if we look at this model, if we go back to this model of resilience for Bangladesh, and this is, this is a bit of a moot point whether it's actually like this, but you can argue that this cyclone in the 1970s, early 1970s, Cyclone Bula, that initiated this cyclone preparedness program. It helped act as a catalyst to improving flood warning, and that led to adaptation. And then following the cyclone in 1991, which killed 140,000 people, that was another catalyst to improve cyclone shelter design, also for more people to join the volunteer group. So they're sort of, you could say they're approaching this transformation stage where resilience has really, really transformed itself and people are much more resilient. And the other country we looked at was Cuba. So why Cuba? Well, two main reasons. It's very close to the United States, as you can see from this slide. So it tends to be hit by the same tropical storm systems and hurricanes. And the other interesting fact is that between 2003 and 2011, there were 45 deaths per million people at risk. So 45 deaths per million people at risk in the USA from hurricanes. But for the same time period in Cuba, there were only 2.5 deaths per million people at risk in Cuba. So basically, it's almost a almost a 20-fold difference. So it looks like they're doing something right. It's, you know, it's right in the hurricane path. It's not very well off, as you can see from these statistics. So the question is really, what were they doing to help to increase community resilience to hurricanes and coastal flooding? And just to note, it's important just to note on this slide, just the two adjacent nations, Haiti and Dominican Republic, because similar to Bangladesh, we looked at the human cost of cyclones and coastal floods, but we compared them to their neighbours. So here we have a slide of the various decades with the number of fatalities from cyclones and coastal floods. The red is Cuba, the blue is Haiti, and the green is Dominican Republic. So, you know, sort of all pretty bad in the 60s, very high death tolls. But as we begin to move on, you see that the death toll in Cuba is relatively low compared to its two neighbours. And that sort of begs the question, well, why is the death toll from cyclones and coastal flooding lower in Cuba than Haiti and the Dominican Republic? And, you know, could we kind of unpick, are there any lessons to be learned from that? So similar to Bangladesh, this is a table showing the measures that Cuba has implemented over the years. So again, you've got the cyclones in red, and you've got a whole series of measures that have been put in place, a whole portfolio of measures over time. And again, I won't go through them all individually. I'll pick out some and I'll point you in the direction of a paper where you can study this if you're interested, this particular table in more detail. So one of the things that Cuba does very well is that they're very well organized in terms of having this yearly annual evacuation called the Meteoro. So it's organized at all levels, everyone takes part, so that there's this annual evacuation practice. Everyone knows where to evacuate to. So everyone from the youngest child to the oldest person is fully aware about where the nearest safe haven is, how they get there, what they need to do when they hear a warning. Evacuations are also very well managed. So although Cuba is a communist country and it's quite top down in its governance structures, they do rely very heavily on community engagement and social networks, which are very strong, and they're organized by military groups. There's also various security measures put in place that help or give some assurance to people evacuating. So the military tend to guard people's homes to stop looting. They're generally very well organized. The shelters are well organized, so they're equipped with doctors, medicines, nurses, psychologists, and even vets. And so that sort of network of trust is very strong, and there's this, what they call a culture of safety has been engendered in the population. Another thing that has improved, similar to Bangladesh, is forecasting. So when Cyclone Flora, which resulted in about 1,500 deaths, hit Cuba in 1963, there were only 2 meteorologists, and since then the meteorology department has developed one of the best in the world. It's a very strong meteorology department. But even given that, and even given their technical strengths, they still had an issue of trust. So one of the issues was that people didn't really believe the forecast. And my Spanish isn't very good, but if you look at Spanish, then a meteorological institute is something like Instituto de Meteorología, and the Institute of Lies is something like Instituto de Meteorología. So that's what people used to call it, because it's a pun. It's very similar. Apologies to the Spanish people listening. My Spanish is terrible, but it's like a pun on it's the Institute for Lies, and that's what it used to be commonly known as in Cuba, because people didn't trust it. So how did they engender trust? Well, they got this guy, Dr. Jose Rubiera, who was a very charismatic guy, but a technical guy. He was the chief meteorologist of Cuba's Institute for Meteorology. And he started presenting the warnings. And he sort of became a local celebrity, really well trusted. And the warnings reached something like 97% of people, and they act on him. So there was a way of engendering trust. And that was really important. And the other thing that was important in Cuba is disaster risk reduction education. So all levels in Cuba, from school to university, the disaster risk reduction is woven into the curriculum. So that helps to give people a very high awareness of what to do, where to go. And as I said, even young kids will know what to do. So in terms of going back to this sort of resilience model and the three types of resilience: absorption, adaptation, and transformation, you could argue that maybe Cuba's reached this transformation by investing in improving its meteorological services, raising awareness, good social networks. But again, this is sort of a bit of a put up as a bit of a moot point. It's just there for discussion, really. So it then begs the question, well, what can be learned by the US? Are there any lessons? Of course, Bangladesh and Cuba are very different in their governance structures, a whole host of things. But I mean, there are some lessons that can be learned, and these may seem stunningly obvious, but building trust is really important. So using trusted community and governance networks to get your message across and to invoke the right action. And of course, maybe, in the US currently, maybe the government isn't the right organization in terms of trusted networks. Maybe there's organizations, community-based organizations. In some communities in the States, faith-based communities, churches are really important. And, there is work being done by county emergency management agencies to work with those faith-based and community organizations to help to put warnings out there and transfer lessons to tell people, look, they are at risk. This is what you should do. It is really worth listening to the warnings. The other thing is education. So it's really important that people know how to respond to a disaster, where to go, when they get a warning, what to do. And it's really useful to mainstream disaster risk reduction in schools. So in the States, the Federal Emergency Management Agency have done a lot of work. They've got a website for children with a lot of disaster risk reduction exercises. They've also started something called Masters for Disasters, which is to teach teachers how they can bring disaster risk reduction into their lessons. But I mean, disaster risk reduction isn't mandatory in American schools, so there's still a way to go. But I mean, as I said, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, have recognized that it's important. So communication is really, really important. I mean, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, there's been a lot of work done in the States and surveys showing that there's a large number of people that cannot interpret the storm surge forecasts and warnings. So even if they receive these warnings, they're not able to interpret them and then understand what they should do. And so it's really important to have different messages for different stakeholders. One of the things in Bangladesh is that, you've got everything from guys riding around in scooters that we saw on the cover slide, to radios, to the internet, to the television. There's a whole raft of different ways of communicating, and there's different messages for different stakeholders. And you need to understand what different stakeholders understand, if that makes sense, because they may not understand what you think they do from a message, and different people in society will take different things away. It's important to understand that to try and tailor the message. The other thing that I think has been successful in the US is building codes. Building codes have changed. So this is a figure from an interesting study which looked at how much building codes have saved lives since 2000. So by either raising houses above coastal surge levels or making them more resistant. And you can see it's something like almost 500 million US. So that's an interesting study. I put the name of that study up there, Building Code Save, and that's, if you look that up, you can download that from the internet. So there's been work done on building codes to make buildings more resilient, and resistant to coastal flooding. So that kind of brings me to the end. I just want to, before I close, give some acknowledgements, because I don't want to give the impression this work was done by myself, because I'm a civil engineer, and this was kind of a bit of a sort of social sciencey type thing. So we were working with Dr. Natalie Suckle, who's a social scientist in specializes in disaster risk reduction. She was at the University of Southampton. She's now at Leeds. Also, Professor Robert Nichols, who was again at the University of Southampton. He's an expert in climate change and coastal risk. And then Dr. Kate White, who is the lead of the Climate Preparedness and Resilience Community of Practice in the US Army Corps of Engineers. And it's a bit of a misnomer, the US Army Corps of Engineers. Most people who work for the US Army Corps of Engineers aren't actually in the Army, as is Kate's not in the Army. But she leads, a lot of all their climate preparedness stuff. So, she was seeing, can we take these lessons and get them into policy in the States? And then Mark Davidson of HR Wallingford, he did all the clever modeling work that you saw at the beginning. And then just finally to close, as I mentioned, and Barbara will put a link to this in the chat. As I mentioned during the course of the presentation, some of these more detailed tables and these diagrams that I've shown you are available in this paper that we wrote, which was published in an open access journal, Natural Hazards and Earth System Science. And you can go away if you're interested to know a bit more, some of the detail, and read a bit more about it, get some more of the figures, then you can go away and download that freely from that site. So as I said, Barbara will share the link, and if you've got any interest, then you can go away and download it. I think that hopefully brings us to questions. So I hope I've stuck to time. So we should have about 20 minutes for some questions if there are any, and I hope I can answer them.
Yep. So we've only got 2 at the moment. So yeah, if anyone's got any more, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. So first one is says, "Hi Darren, great to hear you talking about safe haven locations, shelters in Bangladesh, and the alterations to their design to combat gender-based violence. Do you think the American authorities will need to adapt their design for any social or gender considerations as well?" And that's from Pete Harrison.
Oh, thanks for that. I'm not sure I'm really qualified to talk about that. I think potentially. I mean, I think if you look at Katrina, and I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but it undoubtedly, the statistics show that it affected women more, certainly Black women, and certainly people who were less highly educated and therefore more vulnerable. So I think there may be a case, and if you remember what happened with the Superdome, where the people who had stayed behind, I think in many cases were quite vulnerable, and maybe there are sectors of society who do feel more vulnerable. So I'm not sure I'm best placed to comment on this, but I would say there is a need to look at that, because with all these things, it's generally the more vulnerable people who are left behind, and there's clearly there's a gender-based and an ethnic-based issue, and it's very pronounced from the statistics, one would say, in the US, certainly from the fairly recent events of Hurricane Katrina. I know that was probably 15, 16 years ago, and more recently Sandy. So I'd say probably yes, but yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best place to answer that.
Okay. We've got another one. Hi Darren, for the US storm surge modelling, how did you decide / model when people would actually die? Was it a combination of population age profile and single story dwellings? And that's from Ant at Ramboll.
Okay, hello Ant. Yeah, nice to hear from you. So I'm actually that gives me an opportunity to plug a talk that I'm giving in March on this very subject. So you can learn more about this if you come along to that talk in March, which will be, I haven't got the date in front of me, but it's sometime in the latter part of March. So the modeling that we did, we have an agent-based model called the life safety model. And to answer your question briefly, yes, is the answer. It takes into account a whole range of different characteristics. So it takes into account the age, the weight, the gender of the people that are affected. And it uses empirically based data to see when they're either knocked over or killed by flood water. They can be killed instantaneously, or they can be killed by hypothermia. And yeah, in terms of the buildings, we did have the metadata on what were the single story buildings and what weren't, and that allowed us to set up the model so that people could go along either in their car or along paths to safe havens and vertically evacuate. So it's quite an interesting model, and it interacts with the way it actually interacts with the hydrodynamic model output. So you run the hydrodynamic model at a suitable time interval, quite a fine time interval, and fine spatial resolution. You get the results of the velocity and depth for each, say, maybe 5 seconds or maybe 10 seconds. And the agent-based model of the people interacts with that, and that gives you an idea of the fatalities. So I say it's very uncertain, but and I suspect I'll get asked this in a couple of months' time. It won't give you an accurate loss of life because that's almost impossible to estimate. But what it does tell you, and what it did tell us in this case in Brunswick, was that there were potentially some very simple mitigation measures that could be put in place to increase resilience, which, as you saw, could reduce the number of fatalities by 2 orders of magnitude. So if you're reducing something by 2 orders of magnitude, even though you've got a lot of uncertainty, it kind of gives you a pretty good idea that it should work.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're going to any more.
I've witted on enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That one. We've got another one here. So my question will be how the UK can learn from Cubanese people experience in terms of trust and with more cooperation with authorities and agencies when it comes to largely flooded areas when the seasonal storms have place here in the UK. We had a similar one that was put in the chat box about, how can you see this being applied to the UK? So I guess they're kind of along the same line there.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure I'm that well placed, but I think it's an interesting question. I mean, just to not start off by not quite answering the question, one thing I didn't mention is that this model in Cuba, although of course it's got unique for the Caribbean, certainly, governance structures and history, they have done a lot of capacity building with a lot of other Caribbean nation states and islands, probably 10, 15, to transfer the lessons that they've learned. So for those of you who know a little bit about the Caribbean, the governance structures and the way they run are very different to Cuba, but they have managed to transfer these lessons. And as I said, there are a lot of CARICOM countries that have learned a lot from Cuba. But to answer your question in respect to the UK, yeah, I mean, the trust thing is always hard. I always feel, and I'm not sure if there's anyone from the Environment Agency listening, that the Environment Agency certainly do a pretty good job in terms of warnings. The floods warning directs and other initiatives that they've had. If you compare the Environment Agency to a lot of other organizations, they put out warnings in a whole lot of different languages. They have systems where you have to opt out rather than opt in. But engendering that trust is always difficult, because I suppose if you tell people to do something and it doesn't happen, then you've always got a bit of broken trust. So it's it is a tough one. I think one of the things that happened in Cuba was that they got a technical expert who was also very good at communicating. So he had credibility. So rather than just getting as I think they'd had before, a weather person who was a sort of bit of a TV personality, although this chap did become a TV personality, he communicated in an honest way, but he also had the technical credibility. So I'm not sure I'm really answered your question, I'm afraid. It's a tough one, is the short answer.
The question directly about the UK was from Nicola Smith, who has messaged saying, yes, she is the Environment Agency.
Sorry, Nicola, but I can't help you anymore.
We've got another one here. Oh, just another comment saying, thanks very much. Presentation's very useful. So that's nice. Have I got any more? No, that's it for questions at the moment. Darren, I don't know if you're happy with if people have any more
No, if they've got any
questions coming
more,
in
then
after.
yeah, I mean, we've got another 10 minutes. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. I mean, if as I say, if you want to, then yeah, always doing the self publicity. Do download the paper. It's got a lot more facts in it, and it's got some interesting information. I'm not an academic. The other authors are, so I did try to make it fairly readable, or try to keep it fairly readable. So it shouldn't be too. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. Too social sciencey, in that it should be relatively easy to read.
I had another one come in. So it says, jumping on this question, based on the evidence seen in Bangladesh and Cuba, do you think mainstream education in risk in the UK? I mean, is at risk? Do you think mainstream education in risk in the UK would be something to consider? Oh, sorry, yes, got it. Sorry, that's me being stupid.
Yeah, I think it could be something to consider. I mean, I think it's something that could be woven. Maybe. I mean, I'm not in the education sector, and I know that the curricula are now quite well defined, but it could be potentially something I think would be useful that could be woven into the something maybe like geography, that you could start teaching children about. I mean, I know in the UK flooding is the big thing, about flood risk, about interpreting flood maps, about the different warnings that the different agencies in the UK put out, and what they mean and how to react. So I think yes, and I don't think it has to be a big part. I think we're quite fortunate in the UK. I know that we suffer. There's a lot of people that suffer from flooding, but if you compare us to other countries in terms of the number of fatalities from natural hazards, we're quite fortunate. But I think the short answer is yes. I think it would be useful to include it, and I think it would be a useful thing that you could probably include in geography syllabuses.
Yeah. Oh, just a comment saying thank you, very good presentation. What was this? I can't tell if this is another one. Oh, another one from Tez, who wrote one of the ones earlier. So he's put absorption, adaptation, and transformation. How can this model be applied again here in the UK in the case of severe floods?
Yeah, I don't know. Really. I mean, that was something we put in. It was sort of something that my colleagues came up with. My co-authors, they kind of like this idea, this model of the three components of resilience: the adaptation and the transformation. But I think I'm not sure it's something that you can maybe put in the sort of the absorption and the transformation and all these the adaptation. To me, it was. I'm sort of saying this from my perspective. For me, it was a perspective to describe what was happened. It wasn't a tool to make things happen. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking about it in the wrong way. I mean, I think it is important to think about how you can make transformation happen in terms of resilience. But as I mentioned, that can be incremental or it can be sudden, and it's often, unfortunately, a catalyst that makes us transform things. So even in Bangladesh and Cuba, if you go to those two tables which are in the paper, you'll see that a lot of step changes were made after big events, and those big events, unfortunately, often resulted in lots of people dying. So they really think, people stood back and think, wow, we must do something now to stop this happening again. And unfortunately, maybe it's sort of part of human nature. If you look at what's happening currently with COVID-19, that has transformed society for almost everyone. And that's a catalyst that has changed something. So I'm wittering now. So I suppose the answer is I don't know. I think it's a model to try maybe to describe things. I'm not sure how it helps you, unless you maybe think in those terms that you want to aim for transformation, and that's your goal, that you want to have a a society where you alter the functions as such in this context that they're now really resilient. They're in an improved state in terms of their resilience in this case to flooding, rather than just maintaining the status quo. Because if you'd maintain the status quo, for example, in Bangladesh and Cuba, in Bangladesh, you'd now have probably millions of people dying from one event, because you had 500,000 people dying in 1970. And if you had the same event now, which they have had similar events happening, as I said, the population, I think, has increased probably at least 100% since then. So, you might have 1 million people dying in an event. So I think it's to look at it like that. How do we transform society, which is never easy? There's no easy answer, I'm afraid. I haven't really answered the question, I'm afraid.
I was just going to say, along that line, I don't know if people are aware, the Environment Agency have these 3 what they call Pathfinder projects at the moment, which I partly worked on with Northampton Council, which is all about raising sort of awareness of flooding in general, but in particular sort of property resilience and how on an individual level people can try and protect themselves. And we hadn't done the consultation when I was involved. It was kind of the start of COVID, but it was just quite interesting that a lot of people aren't aware. And you think in this country the amount of information available people would, but I guess it's knowing where to look and things. So yeah, that was from a sort of social point of view quite interesting. And those are ongoing. There's 3, one in the southwest, one in Yorkshire, one around Midlands. So I'm sure we'll see some information come out of those as well, which is sort of linked. But yeah. Have I got one more? It's just another comment about how transformation needs to really result back to reducing carbon emission rates and overall trying to reduce storm events. But I think we all know that it's going to have to be a 2-pronged approach with that.
Yeah, I mean that's the big one, isn't it? How do you get transformative change to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to help to adapt and mitigate climate change? I mean that's the big one. And of course that was one of the reasons that we got involved in this, because at the time when we were doing this, in some states, and it might still be the case in the US, in some states you couldn't talk about climate change, but you could talk about sea level rise. Although of course sea level rise is a result of climate change, there were some states where you couldn't really mention climate change, but sea level rise is becoming a reality in some states. So in some big cities you're getting frequent nuisance, I would say, flooding. So it doesn't result in loss of life, but you're getting frequent flooding of boardwalks and roads adjacent to the sea, and people are noticing. So yeah, so you need transformation to try to combat the overarching thing, which is climate change.
Right, we haven't got any more. Oh no, we've got another question that's coming in the chat. What about multiple hazards, as in the new FEMA map? Does that make sense?
Yes, FEMA map. I'm not so afraid with the multiple hazards. I mean, this we were specifically looking at this piece of work about coastal flooding. I mean, I know that a lot of the work by the universities in the Carolinas have been looking at people's vulnerability. So the map I showed, it was people's vulnerability to environmental hazards in general. So I'm not sure I can say much more on that one, really. I mean, I think the reason that, just to give you a bit more background, that the coastal flooding was really important to the US Army Corps of Engineers, that they're really concerned about the lack of awareness, and also the fact that the lack of awareness is linked to the fact that in many places, as I mentioned at the beginning, there hasn't been a big storm surge for a long time, and that they're very, very worried. If you look at Georgia, it's pretty flat, and there's a lot of people. There's more and more people moving to the coast. So I think they're coming at it more from that than the multi-hazard. Well, they do multi-hazard stuff, and there is work being done by FEMA, as you mentioned. But sorry, that hasn't really answered your question.
So I think that's it for now. So maybe it's a good place to sort of to wrap
time.
up.
That's always good.
We're on time. Yeah. No, we've had some good attendance as well. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join today. And like I say, particularly obviously there's multiple events going on with the different branches now. They're all virtual, but particularly the southern branch, we're aiming to have one event a month. So keep an eye out, and yeah, look forward to joining us soon.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for attending.
Great, thank you. Lots of thank yous coming in, so that's good. All right, thanks everyone. Cheers.